Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm JC, and today's video is going to be an overview of my masterclass experience with Joyce Carol Oates, who teaches the art of the short story. I wanted to take this class because I have tried writing short stories in the past many times, and it has not gone well. They typically turned into novels, or I just stopped because I saw that it wasn't going well. So I really wanted to get some better tools and better um, structure for how to write short stories. Maybe something that could help me curtail the lengthiness, the long-windedness that I have when it comes to attempting short stories. So I wanted to take Joyce Carol Oates' masterclass because that's her thing. She has a couple novels, but her thing is typically short stories. She has tons of collections of short stories. I have a couple on my shelf. Um, and I really was intrigued. I think it's the only masterclass that's specifically geared towards short story writing. So I was very, very excited to take this masterclass, and I was not disappointed. So I'm going to slide on over to my masterclass experience, and I will be back once it's done.
I've always felt that art is the highest expression of the human spirit. And art is the way that we communicate with one another. But that instinct to transcend the particular and the finite and to reach for something universal, that speaks to people across generations. I think that is the instinct for all kinds of art. But I think a born writer wants to tell a story. And that instinct to tell stories is very natural. All you need to do, really, is to take that instinct and transform it into a craft. So if anyone who's listening to me feels that he or she is a writer, you probably are. This class is not about theory or philosophical background so much as it is about the craft of writing and getting you habituated to writing, because we all have stories to tell, but some people just don't have the form quite yet. The master class follows the outline of my class, my undergraduate fiction writing class at Princeton University. So I've been teaching there for many years, and it's the same syllabus that we go through, like 12, 15 weeks, with the short assignments, beginning with really short paragraph, page, 2 pages. So it's basically working with telling stories, which is my anthology, which is for writers. Because when you're a writer, you're not reading just for pleasure, you're reading as a writer. So you have a special eye for prose. I'm Joyce Carol Oates, and this is my master class. Everybody has at least one story to tell. It may be about a mysterious event of the childhood. It may be like, why did this person disappear from your life? If it was a divorce in the family, why did that happen? You know, everybody has a fantastic story, often a mystery story. Because when we're really young, adults are mysterious. That impulse to be a writer, I think, springs from that air of mystery. So I start thinking about a story from the point of view of a character. My writing's all about people. So I'm only really interested in people and personalities. I think our personalities are mysterious and phantasmagoric, because many of us have buried lives and secret lives and lives that they've never been explored. So I got to know the characters as if they were people from my past. So I suggest to my students, if they have a story with a number of people in it, I'll say that, what is this person doing? Like, why is that person there? If they can't answer that, then I say you have to get rid of that person. You know, it's like hiring actors in a play. You have to pay them. You pay 5 actors and you're only using 3 actors. You know, like, you can't afford those actors, so I make them leave. Or I say you have to combine the two. I try to make my students see that this is a practical matter, and you can't distract the reader by having characters who are not important. You begin with a character, something happens, character meets somebody else, then the plot follows after that. That's how I work out a story. So I begin with a character. Well, all art is based upon this principle of synecdocity. In other words, you're choosing and selecting. I once wrote a novel about Marilyn Monroe, and Marilyn Monroe had a number of miscarriages, and she was in a number of at least 2 orphanages and a number of foster homes. So when I wrote about her, I only wrote about 1 miscarriage, I wrote about 1 foster home and 1 orphanage. Because if you're writing about 6 foster homes or 6 miscarriages, you can't really make that powerful. So this art of synecdocity, or choosing, selecting, 1 stands for the whole. That is the principle of all art. Like, if some profound things happen 1 day out of 25, that's the day you write about. So too with a short story. Most of my short stories focus on people at climactic moments of their lives, like it's the one event in their whole lives that's really momentous. That's what I'm writing about. I'm not writing about anything else. First draft should be very, very rapid. I would make the comparison to a wildfire. It should be just flaming around, and you get a new idea for the ending. Like the fire's over here, you just let it all come out right away, and don't try to edit it, because that's so important. I would really recommend to write the whole draft as fast as you can. Just set the whole afternoon or a whole day, and try to write through the whole novel or the whole short story, whatever the unit is, and try to get everything through, even if it's very, very, very sketchy. And if you can do that in 1 sitting, that's very helpful. Then with your first draft, you have such a feeling of power. And you can go back and work on the title, and you can work on all parts of it and take weeks and weeks to write it. I rewrite things countless times. I mean, I don't have any sense of how many times. I really have no idea. By the time I finally finish something, I probably looked at the beginning 1,000 times. I mean, because the beginning gets better and stronger, and you think of a sentence that's a little more interesting. And because you're reading it faster and faster, you're more like a reader. First time through, it's very slow. But by the time I read something for, the 40th time, I'm reading it as a reader. It reads pretty fast. I should emphasize to you that writing is not done all at once. It's a process. So whatever you do on the first day, it's not anything like what you'll be doing on the 40th day. Just, say you're going to be writing for the next year, and you have a whole lot of time. There's no hurry and no rush. So it's like something you're just working on all the time. There's a very important psychological or neurophysiological effect of finishing something. When you finish something and you're satisfied with it, you get a little spurge of energy. When you don't finish something, say you're working on a novel, which I don't recommend for beginning writers. I think the novel can be very exhausting. But short stories, short monologues, poetry, plays, things that you can finish and then show other people, maybe you can get it published. That's very satisfying and necessary for a writer to say, I finished this.
Okay, so in Joyce Carol Oates, her second lesson, she talked about the principles of writing short fiction and gave me a different perspective. First, I was completely captivated by her in this lesson. She almost really made me feel like I could write a short story. And if you know anything about me, it's the one thing that I think I probably have not been confident that I could ever do. But I really want to try, which is why I took this class. So she talked about keeping short stories to maybe focusing on one central character or two, maybe at the most. She said you can have a cast of characters, but sometimes with a short story, it gets too busy. So she suggested limiting the amount of characters you have in your short story and maybe even focusing just on the one person and having that be the central character focus. And she talked about let's see, my notes. Focusing on critical events that may have happened in that character's life. Um, choosing not taking a whole bunch of events because again that would make the story too busy, but maybe one or two or three at the most select events of the character's life that would shape the story or have you allow the reader to get to know the character in a different way, or I'll say in a way that maybe their reaction to a certain event that happened in their life told you more about them than they could tell you about themselves. And she talked about uh, how she brainstorms her first drafts and how she just burns through the first draft, like gets it all down. She doesn't go back to edit anything in her first draft. She just writes it all down, lays it all out as quickly as she possibly can. And she spends multiple drafts after that revising. So she suggested, because she said she had noticed a lot of students of hers would constantly edit during the first draft and go back and revise things as they're writing the first draft, trying to get the story to all come together. And her suggestion was that you just put it all out, just basically get it all out on the page and don't worry about going back and changing things and shaping the story. You can shape it in the revision process. And I think whenever I've tried to write a short story, I would be one of those people that would go back and try to revise and be like, okay, no, wait, that doesn't work. So it's a good tip for me because I think I could probably get it out better if I just write everything that was initially in my thought for that story on the first go around and then go back and, you know, make it take shape. And she also spoke about the importance of finishing, um, not leaving, I guess, not trying to attempt a short story and then feeling like you can't do it and just not finishing it because you never know what you may have there when you go back to revise it, what foundation you have established until you go back and revise it. So, which is another problem I've had because whenever I've attempted a short story, if I see that it's not going well, I just kind of stop. And you're like, okay, this is not working out. I'm gonna go back to writing my novels. So, finishing, good tip. Okay, next lesson.
Artists usually resist analyzing themselves, but I've really found that there are some predominant motives for writing that really have guided me through my life. One motive for writing is self expression, and maybe that's one of the most original It's the self that you're expressing when you write in a diary. And I always encourage my students to keep a journal. I think we all need to keep journals to write quietly and calmly at the end of the day before you go to bed, to write in a journal. If you can write in longhand, that's really nice because it's so intimate and so private. Whatever you can write down in a journal that's descriptive, it doesn't have to be elegant writing. It can have lots of dashes, and breathless writing is really best. To take notes very quickly, impressionistically, describing places and your own reactions to the places. And if you can put a little dialogue in, some exchanges you've had with people. Well, keeping a journal sharpens our senses. It's like an exercise in writing. Otherwise, you just sort of go through the day with the stray thoughts are floating around in your head of no particular distinction. But if you're writing things down and really thinking about something and observing, that gives a certain sharpness to your powers of observation. The kind of writing people do when they don't have time is also important. So I suggest to my students to start writing when you only have 40 minutes and write really, really fast. So you don't have time. Like you have 8 hours, you're intimidated. It's too much time. Well, I could also say that writing when you're feeling very tired is a good idea. Writing when you've been up late, writing when you're ready to go to bed and you're really, really tired, or you're feverish or not feeling well, say to yourself, I'm only going to write for 6 minutes. Well, 8 minutes, well, I'll write for 12 minutes. And then write very quickly. And then the next morning when you see what you've written, that might be really worthwhile. Assignment I definitely recommend for new writers to read Virginia Woolf's wonderful essay, Moments of Being. And this is another work from her diary where she's writing so candidly and so directly. A moment of being is a time in your life, maybe rare, when you have a real insight, a real epiphany. Sometimes people get these overwhelming feelings in times of stress, or there may be a death in the family. And Virginia Woolf writes about having heard that somebody had died or somebody committed suicide. And she gives 3 examples. So Virginia Woolf suggests, which I would suggest to you also, to take a moment of being in your own life. You could have been a child. I'd like to think that the first awareness of mortality in a child is absolutely profound.
And in her third lesson, she talked about journaling and observing the world or observing everything. So she uses her journals. She uses journals to store up ideas for like maybe that story or any future stories. She'll keep details like certain, like if she's writing a historical type of story, she'll keep details from that era in her journal. Different furniture, styles of clothing that they would wear, things like that. That's just an example that, I think she gave an example of that. But different details pertaining to maybe the world or the city she's writing about or the state she's writing about, or just different details in her journal. And she would keep different observations that she would make when she went out. She also, in these journals, she'll, like, if she thinks of a piece of dialogue that she wants to include in the story, she'll jot that down, and she'll jot down all the details that she wants to include in the story before going back to revise. I think she burns through the first draft, and she'll jot down all these details, these little details that may or may not get put into the story, and then she goes back to revise with these details in a separate book. And perhaps I will try that when I give short story writing a try once again. Next lesson after that.
Another very strong motive throughout history is bearing witness, particularly for people who can't speak for themselves. Writing about people, telling the stories of people who have been muted or silenced or even exterminated, and being the one to tell their stories in some historic form, or as journalism, or as fiction, or poetry. I think that's a very strong impulse. Always look into the background of one's family if you go far enough back to immigrant ancestors. You probably find something happened, something going on that was pretty violent. Lots of things went on that are not talked about. If one can face the darkest elements in oneself and things that are secret and buried, I think there's a great deal of power.
So in lesson 4, she talks about exploring taboo ideas and taboo and dark ideas. They make for more interesting stories, things that people tend to shy away from talking about or writing about. Um, if you know anything about Joyce Carol Oates and her writing, she definitely delves into topics that, you know, you wouldn't think most writers would want to like willingly dive into. But so I guess in her mind, she feels like approaching those topics and things like, you know, rape, incest, murder, just like head on at those particular topics, making those types of short stories has always been kind of her place where she rests in. And you know, she said there's a lot of material there. There's a lot of untapped material there because people don't like to talk about those things. So that was her bit of suggestion about writing darker stories and taboo subjects and finding ways to um, interest the reader in discussing those types of subjects. Uh, next lesson.
It's very exciting to experiment with structure. I think that many stories are best told in some elliptical way or some unusual way. There's only one rule of show business or writing, and that's don't be boring. So anything that you can do that's interesting and novel and keeps an audience engaged, almost anything you can do that's not boring will be successful. I've asked my students sometimes to do a story that was just description of the scene, where you're setting the scene very carefully for a story, using really good descriptions and really original metaphors, but then that's the story. The whole story is setting the scene. So I recommend for any story that you have, that you like, that you're haunted by, find some unusual way of telling it. I wanted to write a story that was about a maze. And as you go around the maze, you get farther and farther till you're in the middle. And it might have been something I called The Maze or The Captive. So the story has sentences all around, like in a large type, all around. So you read it like this. And then the next line in is slightly smaller font. So you're going in, and that's slightly smaller. So you keep going around and around, slightly smaller font, until it gets way, way, way in. Then in the middle, there's like a rectangle that ends with like 2 words and a period. So the idea is that some person has gone through this whole maze and ends up in the middle. Those are very interesting because they acknowledge the fact that's neurological, that art comes to us through our eyes. So art and literature come to us through our eyes, and you can do things with the white space that's very arresting. I think the motives for art are very general, and they have much to do with commemoration. Like telling a story is a way of embodying some facts, some history. You want to tell the story of your ancestors. If you're an immigrant family, so you came to North America, let's say in 1850, there's a whole family story. So many writers want to write about that story, and they're commemorating their own ancestors and commemorating their generation. Oprah magazine had a feature some years ago for women writers to interview their own mothers. And I thought it was maybe a little silly idea, but I interviewed my mother and I was totally astounded. And that gave me the idea, not just for one novel, but for more than one. I mean, my mother had so many adventures and experiences we never knew. The children never knew. She never talked about herself. So if anyone has any experiences like that, interviewing a grandparent could change your life. If you're writing about real people, of course, you might want to transmogrify it so it's not so obvious. I mean, obviously, people change names, they change descriptions, they change places. I think that one ought not to exploit other people and never hurt anybody. Never use your writing to hurt anybody. That's not a good motive. Well, another assignment is to revisit a place that means a lot to you in your memory. Deep in our brains, really deep in the deepest part of our brains, are the memories very powerfully encoded of the first room you ever lived in, the first house you lived in, the first people you saw, maybe your young parents, they were young maybe when you were born, and then your grandparents. All those memories are deep in your brain. So the assignment is to take a memory, the earliest memory you have, and to try to evoke it and write about it very powerfully. And if you write about it powerfully, when you finish it, you may have the beginning of a story.
Lesson 6, she talked about ideas of writing in the familiar, which is more about tapping into your childhood and memories from your childhood, like, how school was for you back when you were a child, or how, um, depending on how your home life was, um, discussing those childhood things. She also suggested interviewing a family member and how you can find out so much about, family members that they might not have ordinarily discussed before. Um, she said she found out a lot about her mother and things that happened to her or around her when she grew up by kind of giving her an interview of sorts. And, it gave her lots of ideas and plenty of ideas for short stories and even I think a novel. I think she wrote after that was kind of centered around her mother, or at least that was the initial draw to writing that. Um, she suggested looking at your childhood in terms of, hold up, let's see, any like unsolved mystery type way, things from your childhood that maybe caught your attention and you always wondered about but never got addressed, like you never got that question addressed or that question answered, and kind of going back into your childhood and be like, I wonder what happened to so and so, or I wonder why this happened. No one ever answered my question then. And then just kind of letting your imagination kind of run wild with that mystery to that aspect of your childhood. So I thought that was interesting. There's a lot of things in my childhood that I probably could tap into there. Just gonna leave that there. And I'll be back next lesson.
One of the most exciting exercises for a writer to do, particularly an emerging writer, is not to try to write a whole short story or a conventional story. Write a miniature narrative. This could be one paragraph long. It could be page long. So a miniature narrative takes place very quickly. If you can tell a story as briefly as possible, it's more dramatic. If it's too long, then it has the problems of pacing and could get a little slow. But the shorter you can make a story, the better. If you don't have time for characters, you have time for an incident or an event, something that happens. So I try to get my students always to work in short forms and work up to longer forms, and then not start on a longer form immediately. Well, monologue is a literary form that is very short. Some monologues are only a paragraph long, and very few monologues are more than a couple pages long. If you have dialogue, it's usually longer. So the monologue is just somebody speaking, but usually it moves from emotion A, emotion B to emotion C. Usually there's a trajectory or an arc of emotion. So it starts off with something, just a statement, and it takes you through some emotion and some acceleration and intensification. And then there's an ending that may be a little startling if it's dramatic. The monologue I've often assigned takes you from one emotional level to another. Like, it may start off very somber, it may be funny. It may start off quiet and then get angry and then reside again. And so that you have an arc of emotion. So however it starts out, it doesn't end that way. It ends in a slightly different way. It's very important to look forward to your work. And the playfulness is something that comes with letting your imagination go. It's very important to project your own imagination into someone else. For instance, if you're a fairly young person, to write from the point of view of an older person. It gives you an immense objectivity, and the perspective is just so much more interesting. I wouldn't be writing the way I write now if I hadn't read Lewis Carroll. And I wouldn't be writing the way I write now if I hadn't read James Joyce. I read Chekhov when I was probably 18 or 19, and Chekhov made a strong impression on me. I also read Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights, when I was about 15, and that made a strong impression. All writers have mentors who begin when they're children, and they're aware of writing, they're aware of books that they love. I would say, almost dogmatically, that you can't be a writer unless you're reading all the time and reading with purpose. Not just reading to waste time or reading something on the internet, but reading crafted work. If you just sit down and read a little novel by Jean Rhys, which is like Wide Sargasso Sea, it's like maybe 120 pages, that novella, that short novel, is so good that when you start writing the next day, you're going to be writing better. You're not going to be imitating her, but you'll be writing better than you would be if you hadn't read it. And so reading is the springboard to writing. what you read and what intensity you read is going to determine probably what you write. Because all human beings are imitative. The more you read and the more you're absorbing, when you start to write, you're going to write on a higher level than you would be if you didn't read these people. There are two kinds of readings that are really helpful to young writers. One of them is spontaneous and improvised, where you simply find a book maybe in a library or in a bookstore, and you can even be drawn by the cover and just start reading it and be plunged into a world you didn't anticipate. You might really love that book. It might change your life, or it might not be too important. Then the other kind of reading is systematic. You decide very clearly that you're going to read all of the young Hemingway short stories. So you just say to yourself, I'm going to read 25 short stories by Ernest Hemingway. And I'm going to read them more than once and learn from them. So that kind of reading is what you may get in a university course or community college or your own, maybe it could be a course online or whatever. It's systematic.
Lesson number 10, she dedicated some time to talking about how important reading is to writing. Reading and studying writing. And she said there are two different ways to read, which I thought it was a good thing to point out. Spontaneous, improvised reading, and systematic, planned, strategic reading. And I think, the latter, the strategic and more planned reading is, she was talking about reading in terms of a way to study form and structure, and like someone like me who's not good at writing short stories, to read more short stories, not purely for enjoyment's sake, but as a way to be critical of the structure and the form and the way the character was written and shaped, and what the story did for me as the reader. And I've read a lot of short stories, but I don't think I've ever. I read novels more critically, probably because I write novels. So I kind of, when I read novels now, I'm like picking out and pointing out things, but I don't write short stories, so I've never actually read a short story in a critical sense, like in a way to pick apart a short story, which I just may now do that. She also talked about, in terms of reading, you want to have lots of eyeballs reading your short. Once you're ready to share your short story, you want to get enough people to critique and read it to get their thoughts on it, because not exactly objective because you wrote it, and you want to be sure, particularly with short stories, that you're being succinct enough and getting how did she put it? You want to make sure the reader understands where you're going with the story. And yes, different readers are going to interpret things differently, but you want to make sure they have the overall feel of what you were going for with the story. And perhaps even them reading it, if they get a different perspective, it could even change the way you revise it, because maybe you didn't think of that perspective before. So it's real good nuggets of information there. Okay.
This is Lindsay and this is Corey, and each of them has written a story for today. We'll be taking up Lindsay's story first, and we'll take up Corey's story. But first, we're going to talk about a classic, famous American story by Ernest Hemingway called Indian Camp. So this story has all the quintessential elements of a classic Hemingway story. The nature of the style, the movement of the story, the pacing, what is put in, and particularly what's left out, what is implicit, what's implied. Just a minimum of characters, no last names, characters who are related to one another in ways that might be a little bit mysterious, but if you read it carefully, you can figure it out. I think one of the main things to remember when you're writing is that writing should be pleasurable, it should be fun, it should be exploratory. You should be writing about things that surprise you. So you wake up in the morning, and before you get up actually and open your eyes, think very excitedly about what you're going to be working on and feel that something surprising and novel and maybe a little startling or even shocking will happen before noon, and it will happen in your writing and nobody knows about it but you. And that's because writing is like a spiritual manifestation of something deep within us we don't really know is there. So it's like a painter painting work that is so beautiful, but inchoate and putting it out on a canvas and other people can see it. So it's analogous to that. Then another thing you should remember is as you write, that writing is not done in one day. You're not going to write a novel in 1 week. You won't write a brilliant short story in 2 weeks. And it should obviously be the case that you don't have to be prolific. If you write one really brilliant short story a year, that's great. If you write one novel at all, that's really all that one expects. I have no expectations of anything in my own life. Because I was the first person in my whole family even to graduate from high school, nobody had any expectations from me. My parents didn't expect anything of me. And I think that's really a blessing. So I wouldn't expect anything except the pleasure of writing and the excitement of sending things out and maybe getting published and finding an audience, which is purely positive. Thank you for watching and spending time and working with me. I felt really excited about writing again, and I hope you will be also.
Right, so all in all, and I didn't do a whole lot of individual assessments going back through the class, but that's because quite a few of the classes she did individual studies, and she broke down particular stories, which I love that she did that, because as someone who doesn't write short stories, or at least doesn't write them well, I needed that. It's very different, and I mean, logically, I know a short story is very different than a novel, but the strategic method in the revision of a short story is different than a novel, and the way she broke down these individual stories, there were several of them that she discussed or read from during the class, and the way she picked apart certain things, I was like, oh, I've read a couple of the short stories that she mentioned, but I never picked out or saw the details she picked apart in it. And the way she broke down the different structures, there's one story she talked about, let's see, Use of Force by William Carlos. And now that's a story I have never heard of or read before. And she includes, because her workbook is phenomenal. I'm going to actually go back and do a workbook. I may do a companion video after I've done her workbook, because she gives a lot. She gave some individual assignments during the masterclass, but there are a lot more assignments in the workbook. And then the stories are included in their entirety in the workbook. So this story she read from a little bit, and went back and read over the whole story, and it was interesting because there's dialogue, there's clear dialogue. When you read it, you can hear the this person talking to this person and this person asking this person a question, and you can hear it, but there's no dialogue tags. Like when the word scrolled, and when you read the story, there's no obvious dialogue tags, there's no quotation marks, there's no he said, she said, the things that you would expect that you would see in a normal novel. And I had never thought of being able to write dialogue in a short story in that manner. um, every time I think of dialogue, I think of dialogue tags. And yes, I know that there are short stories that have dialogue tags, but this particular one, I had never seen a short story without dialogue tags. And I, before I saw this, I would have worried that without the dialogue tags, how can you be clear who's speaking to who, and what's being asked of this person? But it's very clear, or at least in the way she read it, it's very clear who's talking to which character. It's only three characters in that story. Three, four, five. It's three characters in that story, and one of them is a child, and it's very clear, even without the dialogue tags. And I think that's so excellent for a story to be that clear of the dialogue without the tags to let me know who said, he said, she said, whatever. And I never even thought of writing a story that way. And I just got all kinds of different inspiration for my eventual venue into short story writing. I wasn't sure I was ever going to want to try short stories again. This is why I wanted to take this masterclass. And yeah, I'm definitely going to give it another shot. Her class it's amazing. Even though I only took 6 pages of notes, the reason that is because of the different classes that she did, where she broke down individual stories. There wasn't really anything to take notes on per se. It was just intriguing, or it was enough to listen to the breakdown of the stories and the pros and cons that she found in the stories. And at the end of the master class, there are 2 different approximately 30-minute classes that she brings in 2 of her students with her, and each of them have written a story. One nearly 30-minute class is for one story, and one is for the other. And to hear them bounce the ideas back and forth off each other of what went right with the story, what needed to be changed, it's different, the perspective, because Joyce Carol Oates got something totally different from each story than the other person who was also reviewing a story. And it's interesting how these 2 people came away with 2 different ways of looking at this short story. And I love this class. I can't even say enough about it. If you have not ever delved into writing short stories and you want to give it a try, but you're not sure if you can do it, or if you even have the tools to do it, please take this class. It's wonderful. She's completely captivating in her manner of instruction. The way she breaks down these different stories and talks about different ways that you can do the stories, different like monologue narratives, different ways to structure the character, different ways to structure the events that take place in the story. She even gives you different ideas for short stories. The ideas that she's had that she said she doesn't plan on using, so you can use it. I came away with so much inspiration, and I'm like, ooh, I could do a short story about that. And when she talked about different, like going into your childhood, I'm like, oh, there's so much there. I could do a story about that. And I loved it. I can't say enough about this class. I gave it a 10 out of 10. And I was riveted by her instruction. Yeah, pretty sure I can't gush enough about this class. So yeah, that's going to be it for this video. If you like what you see and you want to see more videos from me, make sure that you hit the like and subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, do you write short stories? And if you do, what tools or tips would you give a budding short story writer or future short story writer like myself to get in the headspace for writing short stories? Because I'm intimidated, just to let you know. Yeah, so till next time, have a blessed day. Bye.